Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. We're your source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development, where we share original research, explore industry trends, and interview executives and thought leaders from across the globe. We hope you join us often for practitioner-oriented content around all things related to leadership, HR, talent management, organizational development, and change management. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Do you enjoy the Human Capital Innovations Podcast? Please subscribe, leave a review, comment, share, and consider supporting the podcast on Patreon, even at the producer and sponsorship levels. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I talk with Dr. Gregory Bott about entrepreneurship, governance, and leadership in the modern world. Dr. Gregory Bott, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Hi, thanks, John.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from Alberta, Canada. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about the world of acquisitions and really from an entrepreneurial governance and leadership lens, just trying to understand how all of this plays into the ways organizations function in the modern world and how we can do that more effectively within all this complexity and uncertainty that's swirling in the world all around us. As we get started, I wanted to share Greg's bio with everybody. Dr. Gregory Bott is an entrepreneur and investor. At age 24, he quit his full-time corporate employment in pursuit of both higher education and entrepreneurship. Since then, he has owned and operated numerous businesses across multiple industries, including hospitality, real estate, and agriculture. A governance and leadership expert with 4 degrees across 3 continents, he instructs at the University of Alberta and chairs one of the largest social services agencies in Alberta, Canada. And you can find out more about him at www.gregbott.com. What a tremendous background. Anything else you would like to share with listeners by way of your background or personal context before we dive on in further to the conversation?
I think you got a lot of it. More recently, I've been a lot more purposeful on where I spend my time, and just really trying to narrow that down. And a lot of that lately is, outside of the businesses has been this community service, which is working with or on nonprofit boards. And where I find I could contribute the most is in the social service sector, just where my skill set and passion has been more recently. And then the personal development, and that's one where you can really relate to. And I look at your bio and everything with the academic piece, but more recently, going back into the classroom and instructing on some of these topics, I find when you're teaching, it's you think you're projecting a message to students, but teaching is really a piece of self-reflection as well. So as I was writing the book, for example, those two just worked hand in hand. And, if you have to teach it to somebody else and you're in front of a students, you really think a lot more methodical about some of the material and relate that to practice.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And it's one of the things as a teacher or a trainer in a corporate setting or whatever, I have to remind myself regularly that I'm going through that constant self-reflective practice as I'm trying to figure out how, what I'm going to share, how I'm going to share it in the most effective way possible. And I have to remember that I have to help people in the audience or students in the classroom with those explicit connections that in my mind are obvious because I've gone through that thorough self-reflective process, but may not be obvious to those who are listening to me, right? And so part of curricular design, pedagogical approaches, whether in a corporate setting or in the classroom, is all about helping people make those connections, have those guideposts, and be able to see the forest from the trees from all the specific things you may be talking about. So that is a great thing about doing what we do, and it's one of the reasons why I love it.
Yeah, I find like my earlier academic or my earlier entrepreneurial career, I was very much in a silo. I had mentors and we had people that we leaned on, but I was very much in a silo. And more recently, doing these types of podcasts, writing the book, it just more time for reflection. And, the book, for example, I spent first year of the book reading and doing the research for that, read 100, 120 books in that. And as I wrote, I started writing the book thinking I had a message to tell. And over that time and researching and reflecting, that message shifted and I came out with different principles and a different person having gone through that process. So you start at thinking you have a message and that message shifts as you really dive deep and reflect and you learn about yourself. The more you're out there, the more you're talking to people, the more when I do a podcast, I re-listen to it and think, what can I learn from that and how can I do the next one better? So I think to just always be on a journey. And yeah, if you're talking and preaching to other people, you learn about yourself in the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. You've already referred to the book a couple of times and kind of your self-reflective journey there. Obviously, so much that goes into the writing of a book, and you pour your heart and soul into it, and you hope to share something that's going to be helpful to other people. Why don't you start now by telling us a little bit more about really why you wrote this book, and then we can start to get into some of the key takeaways for listeners.
So my previous experience with businesses had always been with startup, whether that be on our own or franchised. And there's a lot of risks and things that are inherent with the startup that provide for a lot more swings in your wealth, a lot more swings in your emotion. And a few years ago, we'd shifted, and one of the companies that we owned undertook an acquisition. So we purchased the business of a competitor and merged that into our existing organization. And I remember, sitting back a month into this and looking up at my business partner and just saying, that was a little bit too smooth. We had just doubled the size of our company, or I guess tripled it, just with one signature. And we woke up the next day and we were 3 times the size. And we had spent the number of years prior to that just trying to get where we were, and then just to have this success overnight. And that made me kind of step back and think about, why did that work? And there's got to be more to this, and why aren't more people doing this? And what I realized in that reflection is that when we think about entrepreneurship, we tend to think about entrepreneurship and the startup as synonyms. And it's nobody really thinks about it as the acquisition. And I think a lot of that is the news that we hear and what's portrayed in the media are these really sexy stories of young individuals. They start this tech company in their parents' basement, and in their mid-20s or early 30s they become billionaires. And these are the stories that we gravitate to. But in reality, they're the outliers. They're not what the data suggests, and they're not actually the norm. They're just anecdotes and outliers. And in reality, if you take a more objective approach or reflection on this, the startup tends not to have a very strong risk reward trade-off. And that's what leads to the high failure rates. So with an acquisition, you really have some history to that. And there's just so many things that come with an acquisition that you don't have with a startup. And, for example, when you buy a business, you have a proven reoccurring revenue stream with a proven history. So you actually have some data to analyze. It's not a guess and test model. You're looking at that and what you're purchasing with some safety net. You have an existing customer base. So their purchasing history, their trends, the amount that they purchase, what frequency, the products, they've been tested and refined. So you have this proven value to the customer that you're not having to reinvent the wheel. That's already been done. Somebody's gone through that process. In our acquisition, we inherited some really strong staff, and that's what kept those relationships with the customer and suppliers. And they were already trained, they're developed, and they're just exactly what our business needed at that time. And one of the biggest things for scaling a business is making sure it gets to the point that there's existing systems and processes in place. And as long as you're buying a business that's reached that level of maturity, they should have that system and processes and structure. And all you really need to do is tweak and play with that. And it's really easy to bounce off of that existing model. And you can take that to the next level a lot easier than you can taking a startup to where that last owner left off. I think a good example is, the business that we bought. The previous owner had been in that grind for 10 years. He had missed, kids' soccer games. His wife had some health issues, and he didn't always feel that he could be there for that. And it took him a lot of time to get up to that level where he felt the business had that process and structure where someone could bounce off. And we just stepped in and inherited that with a signature. And now it's a lot easier for us to go and run with that. So I think that was just a story that I wanted to tell, because it's not a common story. And a lot of people just having that startup and entrepreneurship as synonyms, people don't think of or see themselves in this acquisition or merger journey, where in reality it's an opportunity that's open to anybody. We just don't think of that, and it's not our first reaction when we think about entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Super interesting story and examples, that you're sharing here. And yeah, I talk to lots of entrepreneurs or solopreneurs who are thinking about scaling or who have had success scaling. And you just bring up a really, really important point, that it is so challenging to systematically scale in a productive, healthy way, to scale a business. And while that's certainly one option, like over time, you grow in revenues and client base, you add more employees, you scale your business. I live, south of Salt Lake City. It's a tech corridor. We have lots of unicorns here. We have lots of tech companies that are growing like at crazy rapid paces. So if you live in that kind of an environment and you see it all around you, you just think, oh, well, that's what you do. Everyone scales. Like, you know what they also do? They're constantly going through mergers and acquisitions. And that is also how they help to fuel the growth, right? And so I need to be really mindful about that as I'm thinking about my grind in my business. If, most people, 80+% of the US economy is based on small business. And so most people are in small business. I don't know how it is in Canada, but it's probably something similar. And most people are in small businesses, and most people stay in small businesses. So if you're really looking for growth and scaling, what you're sharing is just a really important component to that we just can't ignore.
And people do have success in startups, and I don't want to diminish that. But I like to think about wealth. Business is building wealth, and that's a lot of why people are in it. There's this personal fulfillment and other reasons to be in it. Give back, develop a certain income so you can give back to the community. But if we look at business as wealth accumulation, startups they have these cycles. You have ups and downs, you have failures, and you take a step forward and then you get hit and you take 2 steps back. Where we look at earlier literature on wealth accumulation, it always talks about incremental gains. So if you can just gain that 10% or a certain amount every year, and you have cumulative returns, that's what builds wealth over time. And what acquisitions does, and some of these attributes I talk about as an acquisition, it's really building that moat around your wealth and looking at your journey of wealth and putting as much priority on wealth retention as you do on accumulation. So it's protecting, every time you gain, you're protecting that gain, and you're not risking what you've built in order to go to the next level. And that's what an acquisition does when you talk about the systems and you talk about the proven history, and really having some hard data to analyze and not moving into that guess and test mode.
So let's say anyone listening, you're thinking about scaling your business and you're thinking about this acquisition approach. what are some of the specific things I need to be considering if I'm trying to decide whether I just want to kind of slowly grow organically over time, or if I want to go the acquisitions route in engaging what seems to be right for me and for my business? Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Academy. Courses, micro-credentials, and certificates to upskill and reskill for the future of work. All HCI Academy courses, micro-credentials, and certificates are designed, developed, and delivered by award-winning and internationally renowned scholars, educators, thought leaders, executives, and practitioners. Our courses, micro-credentials, and certificates will help you make your mark on the future of work and make an immediate impact in your organizations. Check out the HCI Academy and our many course offerings and certificates to upskill and reskill for the future of work. Check out our new weekly LinkedIn newsletter, Alchemizing Human Capital, exploring industry trends via original research and interviews with executives and thought leaders from across the globe. We look forward to having you join us.
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is buying the right business. So that's setting yourself up for success. And then once you've done that, it's building in processes and systems which would follow, more of a Michael Gerber philosophy. And, there's more contemporary authors on that, like Allison Maslin. So when I talk about purchasing a business, I really have this fixation on just stability or dull businesses. And what you get with purchasing that, I look at fundamentals in order to set yourself up for success and buying an enduring business. So things like, is it a fixed cost versus a variable cost model? Where a fixed cost, we saw a lot of organizations in COVID close their doors, and they tended to be ones that were in a fixed cost model. They had storefronts or retail. And when their revenues dropped, they quite quickly went below their break even and below that, high commercial rents, and they didn't have any choice but to shut their doors. Where ones in a variable cost model, if their revenue dropped, their costs dropped proportionately. So although they're making less money, they were still surviving. And that just that was one piece of risk that the fixed cost model had. And it's also easier to scale a variable cost model because you're not necessarily needing these large capital injections in order to scale the business. You can just add expenses that follow that increase in revenue. Other ones, recurring versus non-recurring revenue. If you have to constantly go rebid on jobs, you're always at risk of, not having this predictable revenue. Where companies that have subscriptions or longer term contracts, they just have this safety net that they can, one of our organizations, I can tell you 6 months, 8 months out what our revenue is within 10%. We still have the option of growing that, but I know where our customers' loyalty is. I know what our attrition is, and I can tell you that where a lot of businesses can, and a lot of businesses that I've been in, we didn't have that either. Things like customer concentration, when you're doing your due diligence, what percentage of customers make up your top 10, 20% of revenue. So if you bought this business and your top 2 or 3 customers left, what would that do to your business? And if they make up a large portion of the revenue, you could be left debt servicing this company and have this cost to carry that, but your revenue disappeared. So again, kind of a risk mitigation strategy that you look at in due diligence. And then really seeking just in general, is this the type of an industry that is going to be here 10, 20, 30 years out, whether you're still the rightful owner of that business or somebody else is that an industry that's going to be around? And a lot of authors and academics talk about, this inverse relationship between glamorous companies that tend to be trendy and long-term profitability. So really, you still look for a business where your passions are aligned, it's missing the ingredient of what you're good at. So if you're good at operations or if you're good at marketing, find a business that needs those skill sets at that time to be the owner of that, but really look at risk mitigation in that to make sure that you have a stable business and that this business is going to give you returns and cash flow over the next number of years that you have it.
Yeah. And in all of this too, you have the people management components, the leadership components. So you referred to earlier, you have with one sign of the signature, all of a sudden, you scaled over time, you put all this blood, sweat, and tears into it. And now just overnight, you've grown your business so much. Now, like legally, technically on paper, you've grown your business. But there's also then you have to figure out how you're all going to be working together in the same organization, how all the governance components go into that, all of the systems, the processes, the culture, the onboarding, just all the policies and practices of the organization, how you're going to get people onto the same page. And I'm wondering if you could talk to that for a minute about some of the things we need to consider, or maybe some of the good things and challenging things you faced as you've done that in your own career.
Yeah, I think integration is a big one in culture. So one organization that I'm working with right now, we're looking at some level of the pendulum of whether merging or just working with another organization. And we're really going to different levels of the organization and trying to understand culture. So if we were to do this, or if we were to land on a certain level of that pendulum, how would staff react? How would the management style of this organization be able to work with the staff of this other organization? So I think culture, every organization just takes on a culture, and you could probably speak to this better than myself, but just making sure that you really understand that. It doesn't mean that it's an insurmountable hurdle. It just means that you really have to be aware of it. And there's so many little hidden intricacies where and preferences that you just need to be aware of within culture. But if you get it right, it really works. And then in our last acquisition, we realized really shortly that there's things that they were doing better than us, and we absorb their processes and structure into the kind of the greater merged organization. And there is some things on the tech side and the process side that we were doing better, but we had the ability to then pick and choose, because we were pulling from two organizations and two skill sets and two cultures, and we could really cherry pick what we wanted. And the greater organization, the merged organization, was better collectively than each individual. So in that case, 2 + 2 = 5 or 6. And that also came out on the bottom line, because as we merged, we had 2 offices came to one office on a, from a fixed cost perspective. And, not unfortunately, but 4 staff plus 10 staff didn't equal 14. So there's some efficiencies there, and it worked out for everybody. But it just, from an economics of it, and from a culture perspective, and from a systems perspective, there's just so much learning on both sides, where the greater organization is better than the individual components in a merger.
Yeah, you described that so well. That and it's a problem I see in many organizations, especially when it's an acquisition. That you have, the acquiring company that then says, okay, you are now going to assimilate to everything that we do. Now, there's a certain time and place for, I suppose, that kind of an approach. But more often, what's a healthier approach is how you just described it, where you look at the competencies, the capabilities of both organizations that are now coming together, and you're looking to learn both ways, right? So the strengths of the acquiring company that you tried to then build into the culture and the processes, the systems of this newly formed organization, right? That is now grown, but also the company that has been acquired. Just because that organization has been acquired doesn't mean they don't have capabilities to bring to the table. And in fact, the opposite should be true if you just acquired them, right? They should have human capital, financial capital, intellectual property, systems, technologies, whatever. They should have things that add value to the organization. Otherwise, you wouldn't have acquired them in the first place. Recognize that, tap into that, pull that into your organization. And like you said, culture, it's a challenging thing. And there's no like prescription for this. It's just, you have to be mindful about it. You have to be proactive about it. And you just have to be intentional about putting the time and energy and resources into creating and sustaining the type of culture that you want. And so, I don't have the answer for any specific organization. I can't just sit here and tell you, okay, this is what you should do. It depends, right? It depends on organizational context. It depends on the people involved. It depends on the organizations that have just merged or have gone through the acquisition. All of that depends on what you're going to do. But as long as it's at the forefront of your mind that this is something that's going to be really important, that you have to be thinking about and considering, I think you're up for the challenge. You're going to be able to do it. And you described some really important things to consider as we're going through that process.
Yeah, you just made me think of another thing is, in an acquisition or any type of organizational change, there's always this fear of flight risk. So will we lose customers if we bring them into a different umbrella? Will we lose staff? And I find a lot of those fears are unfounded. You don't lose staff and you don't lose customers. From a staff perspective, if you are open ears, you're listening, you're empathetic, you get to that conversation early and ahead of that conversation, people are looking for purpose. They're looking for, they don't want to uproot their own career if they don't have to. So if you're there early, you're in those conversations, you're listening, you're providing opportunity, you're taking some of their skill sets and recognizing that within the greater organization, people aren't flight risks. You can do a merge or an acquisition without losing any staff. And the same is with customers. On our last one, that was one of my biggest fears, because I was fairly green to that type of a transition. And I just had this fear of, what happens is 10% of our customers just don't like this new branding. And like, we got to them early, we phoned individually, and they were just like, they hadn't actually had that love for a long time. And just by us reaching out and checking in and providing good service to them, we didn't lose any customers. And we actually went back a number of months later and had the ability to raise our fees. And there's no way I would have thought we could have done that when, a few months prior to the acquisition, but we just built that relationship. And so I think, that's part of it, is just providing that opportunity for staff. And the greater organization tends to have more capacity to provide that than the individuals, smaller organizations.
Yep. Well said. Well, Greg, it has just been a pleasure. I know at the time I'm going to have to let you go here in a few minutes, but as we're starting to wrap things up, before we close, I wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your work, where they can find your book, and then give us a final word on the topic for today.
Sure. Thanks, John. Yeah, you can visit my website, gregbott.com. It has more about the book in my bio, and there's a way to reach out to me as well. I just think lastly with business and acquisitions, a lot of times when we look at media, or we look at larger companies, we just don't see ourselves reflecting back in the mirror, and these stereotypes of what we've been led to believe an entrepreneur should look like. We don't see that when we look in the mirror, but in reality, entrepreneurship is open to anybody. Acquisitions are open to anybody, no matter age, education, current wealth. It's the business that builds wealth. You don't need wealth before you start. So just being open to it. And if it's something that you're interested in, just engage with the literature and engage with people and start to engage with the grind.
Wonderful. Thank you, Greg. It has just been a pleasure. I encourage listeners to reach out, get connected, find out more about Greg and his team. Check out the book, check out all the great resources. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week. Bluer Than Indigo Leadership, the journey of becoming a truly remarkable leader. Early in my adult life, I learned about an Asian proverb that translates as bluer than indigo. If you think about the color indigo, it is a brilliant, deep, and vibrant blue, what some would call the bluest of blues. To have something that is bluer than indigo is rare and truly remarkable. Contrary to popular myth, there is no one-size-fits-all or cookie-cutter approach to effective leadership. There is no silver bullet, no secret sauce, no go-to model that will solve all of your problems. The truth is, great leaders have all had their unique strengths and flaws, and have all had to discover and then pave their own distinctive path in their life's journey to fulfill their leadership potential. Bluer Than Indigo Leadership will help you discover your own path and explore those ordinary, everyday actions that will help you respond to an uncertain future and produce extraordinary results for individuals, teams, and organizations. Check out Human Capital Innovations magazine, Human Capital Leadership. Human Capital Leadership is a free, interactive e-magazine with the mission to help individuals, leaders, and organizations find innovative approaches to maximize their human capital potential. We publish issues quarterly in August, November, February, and May. Take a look at the latest issue and let us know what you think. The alchemy of truly remarkable leadership. Ordinary, everyday actions that produce extraordinary results. Consider how the nature of work has shifted over the past 50 years. With increased globalization, rapid technological advancement, and the shift in economic composition, the average job of today looks very different than the average job of 50 years ago. What will the jobs and organizations of tomorrow look like? Moreover, what does this all mean for organizational leaders? What are the core competencies and capabilities of organizations and their leadership that are prepared for continued disruption and geopolitical and socioeconomic shifts? Regardless of what the future holds, increasingly, leaders need to be socially minded, data-driven, decisive, champions of talent, and disruptors of the traditional notions of leadership, teams, organizations, and work. The alchemy of truly remarkable leadership will help you to explore your own leadership competencies and capabilities and consider ways to apply and implement them into your workplace and personal life. Do you enjoy the Human Capital Innovations podcast? Please subscribe, leave a review, comment, share, and consider supporting the podcast on Patreon, even at the producer and sponsorship levels. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week.